Midnight vote. I kicked the door open and said, "No vote tonight," before the microphones could finish warming. Betrayal sat on the conference table like a cold, heavy object, investors' faces sharp under the ceiling lamps. Jonah pressed against the coffee station, Maya holding a neat stack of signatures that threatened everything we had built. My voice cut the room and left no space for softer framing. My chest felt tight. Doubt turned into anger that made my fingers curl around the tablet, and anger thinned into guilt that made my thumb hover over the screen. I had no right to a speech. The council had scheduled the tally. A dozen late, night emails had already convinced half the board that a shake up would protect their capital. Within 5 sentences the problem was plain. Either I delayed the vote and risked the investors' ire, or I let the restructuring go through and watched the company I helped spawn split into smaller, safer pieces. I could hear the investors' watches against the glass. I could see Jonah's face go pale enough to match the stale coffee stain on the counter. A man in a navy suit, board counsel, tapped a legal pad. "Even, you weren't at the call. The investors want a binding decision now. We need time to answer properly," I said. "We need the founders in. Depth review. The investors voted," he said, flipping a page. "They have the numbers and the proxies. This is a ratification, not a debate." Maya's hands didn't tremble. She folded her scarf around her wrist and said, "We collected signatures for an alternative slate. I circulated it 3 days ago when I found the transfer in the account." Her voice stayed level, but her eyes were hard and bright. "You should have warned me, Ivan. Or you should have told them we needed more time." Jonah coughed, then laughed too loud. "You did what, Maya? You made a play." His jaw worked. He looked at me the way teammates look at the captain when the boat starts listing. I had seconds to act. The room smelled like burnt coffee and the varnish on the conference table. I moved across the floor, the soles of my shoes whispering over the polished wood. An investor with a bleached haircut leaned forward. "Mercer, delay risks our funding. Sign the restructuring to protect the company." Doubt had been my first companion that night. Suspicion had landed in my throat like a lump. I could feel the word betrayal in my mouth when I watched signatures, my company's ownership, parcel out across a page I hadn't been given time to read. I thought of the night's Jonah, and I had coded in the open office until sunrise, of Maya sketching product flows with a pen chewed at the tip. Those memories turned specific. Jonah's chipped tooth lighting up when he found a bug. Maya wiping a whiteboard with the corner of her silk scarf. Those concrete moments were why the signatures on that stack mattered like a verdict. I slammed my tablet onto the table. "No vote tonight," I said again, louder, and suddenly the room had 2 conversations, the polite legal one and the ragged human one. Board counsel started the tally anyway. A tall investor said, "Council will proceed unless there's an objection." His phone lit with a message. He glanced at it like someone checking the weather on a trip. Eyes flicked to Maya, to Jonah, to me. The air between us contracted. I felt the uncertain tremor in my fingers, and then practiced steadiness, hands flat, shoulders even. Maya slid one signature forward and named a shareholder I hadn't expected. "This transfer gives me temporary voting leverage," she said. "I didn't plan to use it as a weapon. I planned to force a conversation. But if this goes through tonight, you'll restructure without the founders' consensus." I couldn't let that happen. She set the stack down like evidence. Jonah's laugh broke into something sharp. "You couldn't let it happen. Maya, you went behind our backs." "Jonah, sit down," I said. The sound of my own voice surprised me. It had an edge that didn't feel rehearsed. Jonah crossed to the table and almost knocked over a mug. "We need to be careful. We founded this together," he answered me with a sentence that tasted like accusation. "Even, you signed the last round with those clauses. You changed terms without telling us." That hit like a physical shove. I braced my hands on the table and remembered the lawyer's emails, the investor calls. Phrases like, "protect the cap table," and "remove friction for our exit." I had justified the decisions with spreadsheets, but now Jonah's voice translated them into human cost. "I did what I thought necessary to keep us afloat," I said. My jaw tightened. "I never meant to hurt you." Maya watched me for a long beat. then explain the recent backdoor transfer. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to explain where those shares came from and why a shareholder moved them without notice. My thumb found the ledger app. I scrolled. There it was. A transfer routed through an intermediary account 2 weeks ago. The line item had a small comment. Stability measure. My chest contracted and something like nausea rose. I felt anger again, direct this time, at the ledger entry and at myself. I sat on the edge of the table and said, "We negotiated protective shares under board pressure. I executed what the council advised. You executed it without the founder's notice. Jonah, that's not negotiating. That's hiding." A young investor, one of the newer partners, said, "Mr. Mercer, this is why we asked for restructuring. The current leadership is unstable." My eyes found Maya's face. Her lips were pressed together, not trembling. She looked like a person deciding which file to open next. I thought then about leverage, how fragile it felt, and how quickly it could be manufactured. The emotion inside me shifted. Suspicion had grown into a cold, focusing anger. That anger moved into a different shape when I saw Jonah's body go slack and then shake. Jonah doubled over beside the coffee machine. He made a small sound, then another, and the room's peripheral business peeled toward him. The tall investor's posture didn't change. His watch still glinted under the lamp. Maya pushed a chair toward Jonah and crouched, unfastening a cuff. "Jonah, breathe, Maya." Her altar kept the same level as before, but now the words were a tool, exact and tasked. She snapped off his watch band and rolled up his sleeve, revealing a trimmer in his forearm. Investors murmured. Board counsel stood as if to read corporate procedure aloud. But nobody in the room wanted a procedure to replace the human need that had just surfaced. Jonah's face went red and then pale. He reached for the counter and knocked over a sugar tin. White granules spilled in a small, bright arc. "You did this," even Jonah between breaths. "You changed things and left us hanging." I stepped forward and found my voice without planning. "Jonah, you've worked your ass off. We built this," he snapped. "We did build it. You started protecting pieces of it before we even shipped version 1. We traded sharp lines, 3-4 rapid exchanges, in the way the rules demanded. The argument was a corner where we could see what loyalty cost us." Maya stood and said nothing. Her eyes measured me. I felt the room narrow to a rectangle of wood and glass and the sound of my pulse. Security drifted near the doorway then, a polite presence in a suit, hands folded. I noticed the badge clipped to his lapel and the way his eyes scanned for escalation. I noticed concretely Jonah's backpack curtly swung from his shoulder, a worn canvas strap which had carried pizza boxes and prototype boards for years. Those small items anchored the stakes. Board counsel began the tally again. The murmurs in the room turned procedural phrases into weapons. The investors wanted to protect their capital. I wanted to protect the company and my name. Those aims overlapped and conflicted. The vote count moved. A yes, a no. I tried to find leverage. My thumbs left a set of tiny prints in the tablet screen. Then I did the thing that would define the night. I signed the emergency restructuring documents. My hand, which usually held a steady pen, shook when the stylus touched the screen. I told myself it was for the company. I told myself it was for survival. The papers rearranged active control. Jonah's operational oversight was removed and his role changed from active head engineer to advisor until the board decided otherwise. The signature went through and the council collected the tablet with the polite, solemn face of someone who decompleted a transaction. The room exhaled in different directions. Investors nodded as if to a plan fulfilled. Jonah's body tasted like betrayal. He gagged a little and sat down on the floor, breathing shallowly. Maya's hands were folded. She didn't move toward him. Instead, she tucked the petition stack under her arm and turned her back to the table. Hands gripped Jonah's shoulders to help him up. A security officer guided him out with a gentleness that felt like a bandage over a broken bone. He walked past us slow, his canvas backpack swinging, his chipped tooth catching a light even. He said once, like a single word question. His eyes asked whether I had imagined the line I had crossed. Outside the door, the lobby lights flashed sterile. Jonah left with a small circle of people murmuring apologies that sounded structured, like the observance of a rule. Investors clustered near the glass to give me brief congratulations. Someone touched my shoulder. I kept my face still. When the room emptied, Maya did not go with Jonna. She waited by the doorway, the fabric of her scarf folded over her wrist, the same precise edges she used to wipe our whiteboard. She met my eyes and then slipped away down the corridor. I watched her go. She moved like someone carrying a plan. I followed later into the smaller private office with the lamp that left square light on the desk. She was already there. She set a thin file on my desk with the calm measurement she used for product demos, and the lamp caught the edge of a photograph inside. Jonah at a rooftop barbecue, holding 2 slices of pizza, laughing with a missing tooth on display. Maya, you always compress risk into numbers, even. You forget the people those numbers used to be. I ran a hand over my temple. The scar above my right eyebrow felt like a dull throb. I did what I had to do to keep us alive. She slid the file toward me. I opened it and the transfer details lay plain: names, dates, email headers. The intermediary account traced back through a shell investor entity I had authorized months earlier when counsel argued for defensive measures. The concrete trail of transactions made the abstract term stability feel like a lie in print. My mouth filled with the taste of metal. Maya did not raise her voice. This does 2 things. It proves you signed deals that moved shares without informing the founders. And it shows who profited when the company leaned toward protection rather than transparency. Fix it, Ivan. Set it right or this file goes to others. Her ultimatum landed not as a threat but as an inevitability. She had always been precise. When she was angry, she was surgical, and her anger now cut at the foundation I had tried to shore up with spreadsheets. I felt an emotion shift again, anger into sharp guilt, my throat closing around both. I wanted to argue and stall. Instead I asked, why give this to me now? She answered, because you still have the codes to undo the transfer. Because if you done the investors will pivot, and you will be the one writing checks to keep the company whole. Because Jonna needs more than an escort out, he needs the truth on the record. Her reasons were not a lecture. They were orders that made a plan into a possibility. I touched the file and felt the paper's tooth. It was so ordinary and so damning. I understood that the cost of reversal would be public and messy. Reversal might mean losing investor confidence. Reversal might mean facing criminal scrutiny. The ledger didn't lie. I thought of Jonah on the sidewalk with his backpack, hands shoved in pockets against the cold. I thought of our whiteboard diagrams and the shared nights of takeout. I thought of the signature I had put under counsel's advice and how, in trying to secure the business, I had let the people who built it fall into a narrower definition of ownership. Maya watched me with a kind of quiet acceptance. You can sign corrective notices, she said, or you can let the restructuring stand and watch us fracture. Either course will change everything. I swallowed. The room felt smaller. Outside, through the glass, the city lights were a scatter of steady points. I could hear the elevator 2 floors down. My hand found the stylus in my jacket, and the tablet's glow spelled obligations across the screen. The immediate crisis had already resolved into a new set of choices. Undo the transfer and invite investor fury, or let the restructure secure the company with Jonah sidelined and Maya compromised. I stood and went back to the main war room. The boardroom chairs were empty but for one, shoved back at an odd angle. The signature on the restructuring file still showed on the tablet, a time-stamped confirmation. I placed my palm on the table's burnished surface and felt the grooves worn by years of late night sketches. I had made the survival choice that cost loyalty. Now the consequences lay in front of me as paperwork, and in Jonah's hollow look and in the hard line of Maya's mouth. I felt the hollow of victory, its noise, its obviousness, drop into my chest. My pulse thudded in my ears, and for the first time that night I could not find a spreadsheet to justify the motion. I slid into the leather chair nearest the window and watched the skyline lean into dawn. My phone buzzed once with investor congratulations and then another with a terse message from counsel. Well handled, I let the messages sit. I opened the file Maya had left and read the email headers. The intermediary account S-Trail stopped in an offshore entity that bore the name of an investor partner. The ledger had a signature line with a timestamp I had authorized. The final decision of the night had been mine. I had signed with the intent to hold a company intact, but the act had cut a person out of the work and a friend from his place. The hunger for survival had hardened into a choice that would reshape ownership and relationships. I set the file down slowly. I heard the lobby buzzer far below, security confirming a delivery. 2 guards' footsteps came down the corridor toward the executive floor. I rose and picked up the tablet that held the signed restructuring. The paper file sat beside it, and the photograph of Jonah looked very real. Maya's voice came soft from the doorway. "You still have time to fix the transfer." I stood and said, "I'll start the corrective notice." She nodded once, unreadable. Then hurry, a guard appeared at the office door and announced, "Mercer, we need the signed restructuring documents for processing." He held a clipboard, and the night looked ordinary again in his hands. I walked with the tablet, the slim file under my arm. The city was a grid of waking bulbs behind us. I felt responsibility like a physical weight. Not abstract guilt, but the weight of a signature on a screen and a friend's absence on the steps. At the security checkpoint, I handed the documents over and heard the reader click. The guard's eyes flicked to the photograph at the top of the file and then away. The doors opened. I watched Jonah leave the building earlier, watched Maya leave the building earlier, watched my decision travel through cuffs of paper and back into the world. The last line of the chapter closed with a new action. I pressed send on a draft corrective notice, my finger steady, and then closed the laptop. Dawn turned the glass outside to a thin, pale blue. The city's hum felt indifferent. I stood alone in the empty war room, the lamp light flaring over the tabletop. The slim file Maya had left sat between us, and the tablet with the signed papers sat in front of me. I rose and locked the tablet screen, then left the file unopened on the desk. As I left toward the elevators, a security buzzer sounded downstairs. 2 guards were coming to collect the original signed restructuring document. The chapter ends with their footsteps approaching, and the knowledge that my next decision would either mend what I had broken or make the night permanent. I shoved through the sliding doors and found Jonah Rai's face, down on a stretcher, an oxygen mask loose against his chin, and a pool of coffee cooling on the floor beside his overturned backpack. Betrayal sat heavy in my chest, betrayal not as a word, but as a decision I had made the night before. The same decision that left Jonah too tired to steady himself at the stairs. "Ivan." The nurse snapped, handing me Jonah's medical bracelet. Her tone was flat with urgency. I did not wait to apologize. I searched Jonah's face the way you check a machine for a failing light, quick, precise, without ceremony. I say betrayal because that's the spine of the shape of my movements that night. I had halted a vote hours earlier to prevent a hostile swap. Hours later, one of the team lay in an emergency corridor, chest rising in shallow, uneven beats. The doubt that had followed me into the boardroom, whether I had the right to cut people out, shifted into fear the moment I saw Jonah's hand go slack. Then the fear sharpened into guilt. I pulled Jonah's fingers and felt the chipped nail I knew from coffee runs and late night debugging. My hands shook. I covered them with the sleeve of my leather jacket and tried to calm my breathing. A nurse checked a monitor and said, "He is stable for now, but we need history." "What happened?" I said his last coherent thing. "He left after the vote. He would go home." My voice was thin. The nurse's efficient questions landed like small tests. Medication, allergies, recent trauma. I answered each one in short sentences. The lights cast a hospital yellow on Jonah's skin. His beat matched a monitor that could have been an alarm in another room. Here it was only a slow, steady pace that required explanation. Maya Chen arrived with a bag that had been packed with legal pads and a single silk scarf folded plain at the top. Her face was pale. She kept her hands folded as if she were holding herself together through math. "Not emotion, Maya," I said. "Jonas." She cut me off by gripping the end of the gurney and leaning over him. "What did you do, Ivan?" Her voice was low and measured. That roof of control had always been her sound. "What did you do to him?" My first emotion shift, doubt to panic. I said, I didn't, and the word failed. Maya pulled back and set her glasses on the bridge of her nose. Jonah left the office after you closed the vote. He texted me he was burned out, and then he turned up like this. You made a call, Ivan, you for a freeze. That's when he got isolated. She named the sequence as if reciting a timeline of wounds. I felt my throat tighten. I rubbed my temple the way I did when guilt pushed toward confession and not explanation. Jonah blinked once under the mask and smiled with the half-broken tooth that had always made him look younger than he was. Jonah, I said, pulling my chair close. Jonah. It's even. He mumbled something about a server crash. Then his eyelids fluttered, and he fell against the oxygen like a man settling into sleep. The nurse tightened a strap. The corridor smelled of antiseptic and heated plastic. I heard my phone buzz and stepped into the hallway. Outside, Leela Park's name filled the screen. I stood with my back to the ambulance bay and answered, Ivan, where are you? Leela's voice had the flat, controlled pitch of a person used to moving markets with a sentence. She did not ask about the patient. She about control, UV destabilized operations. Reports say Jonas' emergency call is linked to staff unrest. Investors are getting jittery. I need assurances by noon that you are not diverting assets. Her words landed like a demand for a ransom I could not pay without giving up history. Leela. Yes, in there now, I said. This is not about assets. It's about Jonah and the team. I listed quick facts. The vote. The attempt to pause the hostile transfer. Jonah leaving alone. She cut me off. Even the board will respond to risk. If you cannot show governance, we will appoint an overseer. We can have management instability while we close funding. Her calmness read like an ultimatum. I felt my second emotion shift. Panic turned into resolve. I said, I'll secure oversight measures. I will present a contingency that protects value without bloodletting. The lie tasted metallic going down. At 3 in the morning, Maya and I went to Jonas' apartment. She knocked once and checked the lock. The door was half open. The apartment smelled of cold pizza and solder. On the kitchen table a half-assembled prototype lay under a scatter of cables. Jonah had turned part of his living room into a makeshift lab. I moved slowly. My hands remembered the angles of our old work, prototypes we had built in coffee shops, code that had first fit into a single laptop. Maya crouched at the desk, fingers lightly tapping a locked laptop. He used a hardware key for this drive, she said, if someone wanted him out. They need this kind of timestamp to show internal requests. She held up a small encrypted stick with a grim face. We found an email draft on the locked drive, unsent but stamped 15 minutes after the vote. The draft proposed a payroll adjustment and an explanation that would reduce Jonas' role to part-time, drafted in a voice that matched a corporate lawyer's tone. The timestamp and draft showed someone had prepared the marginalization. Maya's face went still. They planned to make him expendable, she said. Look at the transaction logs. These transfers started before the call you made. I stared at the numbers and remembered the way Mark, our corporate lawyer, had lingered in the hallway the night of the vote. My mind jumped between possibilities. The shift that carried me next was suspicion sliding into strategy. I stopped asking why and started asking who. We called Mark and then Leela. Maya insisted we call a board session. We done run from the room, she said. We bring the room to its knees with proof, or we watch them sell it off. Her voice had that measured edge that had driven us through due diligence. It cut through the panic like a scalpel. I listened, thinking of Jonas' chipped tooth and the empty couches in the office where we had once slept during a beta launch. The memory of me closing a vote in a glass room did not have to be quoted. It hung between us as evidence of how quickly procedure could become weapon. At 9 a.m., the forced board meeting began in the glass-walled room where we had argued months ago over hiring and equity. Mark sat on the far side with an expression that had no softness left. Leela folded her hands and watched the screen. The other board members filed in wearing the tired politeness of people whose lives depended on a cap table. Maya walked to the projector with a USB drive. I will show you something you will need to face, she said. She inserted the drive and the boardroom hummed as the recording played. A clipped, clear audio file of a person with a voice like Mark's advising a transfer and describing steps to diminish Jonas' visibility. The room reacted like a body to a shock. Mark stood and said, "This is forged." "Even you knew about this, Leela? Who produced this?" I felt all the air in my lungs drawn out. My pulse pushed against the collar of my shirt. I held my jaw so it would not tremble. Maya stepped between them with a stack of transaction logs. "This is not forged," she said. "These are timestamps and transfer receipts. They trace to a shell account. The shell account funnels to a trustee that matches Mark's last known vendor ledger. He can explain it, or we can bring it to the regulators." Her voice was quiet, but it carried. Board members exchanged quick, sharp phrases. One of them demanded an immediate audit. Voices rose quickly 3-4 lines of back and forth that felt like blows. "Mark, explain this." "Leela, Mark, explain now." Maya repeated, "We were protecting the company." Mark shot back, "You put us at risk even. You moved funds without board consent." Maya answered, "You insulated a vendor with our IP." "Mark, Leela." The conversation became a thrashing knot of accusation and defense. I spoke when I had to. I called for a pause because of a hostile offer. I said I did not authorize transfers. My sentence was short. The board asked for timestamps. We fed them the files. The energy in the room snapped between legal threat and moral outrage. Then the recording hit a further note. An audio clip of voiced instructions to delete logs after a certain time. The board's posture changed from negotiation to shock. We had a twist. The shell account did not belong to Mark. It belonged to a vendor tied to an investor vehicle connected to Leela's portfolio. Leela's face tightened. She looked genuinely surprised for 2 beats, then composed herself. A mid-chapter mini cliffhanger followed. A board member asked aloud whether the investor side had seeded the plan to remove internal players to smooth an acquisition. The question hung in the glass room like a thrown coin. Maya moved faster after that. She demanded a public accounting and called for an independent forensic audit. Leela pressed for a freeze and an external overseer. The board fractured into factions. Mark insisted on a settlement that kept him out of criminal exposure, but others demanded his suspension pending inquiry. I watched and calculated. The damage control negotiation began in a quiet corridor with Mark and Leela on either side of me. Mark offered a conditional settlement. He would step back and accept oversight if I agreed to a valuation, preserving spin, a corporate narrative that excused the transfers as vendor payments for consulting. "You can ask me to trade Jonah for valuation points," I said. "Jonah is not a line item." My hands found the prototype in my bag, the small device Jonah had been debugging. Mark me, the market would panic if we opened the books. Legal oversight would save the round, and that the regulators would not be involved if we handled this internally. "You need to decide, even, Leela. Protect the company or hang yourself trying to keep everyone." The argument had rapid exchanges. "No. Yes. We need control. We need proof. We need to show we have governance." I listened while Jonas' oxygen hissed in the air down the road. I made a choice in that corridor. I signed a paper that let Mark take a conditional leave and allowed for temporary oversight with an external fiduciary. The deal reduced our operational freedom but preserved our valuation for the moment. I thought of Jonas' laugh, his scuffed sneakers, his habit of coming to the office at dawn to test builds. I thought of Maya holding the USB like a scalpel. The agreement felt like glue over a crack. I had the third emotion shift, resolve thinning into resignation. I wrote the words on the settlement document with a steady hand. That night I returned to the office alone. The workroom still held one burned-out lamp and a prototype case left open. I took the prototype from the table and sat at the conference bench. My palms were raw from the day's grasping. I set the device between my hands and turned it over to feel the cool metal and the faint abrasion where Jonah had once dropped a screw into its housing. I remembered the night months earlier when we had slept on the couches and convinced each other that everything we were doing mattered more than sleep, more than paychecks. I thought of the vote I had shut down in a room full of faces and how quickly control could mutate into a blade. On the conference table, the documents from the meeting sat in 2 stacks. One was a press-ready statement about governance and oversight. The other was Maya's copies of the logs and the recording. I slid the latter into my briefcase. My hands were not steady. I felt empty in a practical way. Tasks to do, calls to make, a company to steady. Not empty in some lyrical sense, but full of a practical list of things that needed fixing. I pressed my thumb onto the prototype's seam and noticed a hairline scratch. Jonas' hoodie hung draped over a chair like an abandoned uniform. I walked to the window and looked out at the cityscape, the office lights sparking like other people's late arguments. I heard my phone buzz and ignored it for a long minute. Then it buzzed again, harder. It was the nurse. Jonah had woken. He for water and a charger. The nurse said he was confused and would be observed overnight. Relief tightened my shoulders, so I could not tell whether it was relief or exhaustion. I thought of what I had paid in deals and what I had not paid with. Human time, trust, Jonah's steady presence. I left the prototype on the table and walked back to the conference room door. The settlement paper weighed like a folded map in my jacket. I had traded freedom for stability and told myself there was no alternative. Maya had watched me sign, but said nothing in the corridor afterward. In the elevator, I saw Mark's reflection and wondered which side of the glass he would choose in the coming days. The next morning's headlines would not print the nuance. They would print an oversight appointment and a suspended lawyer. But Jonas' name would also be in the background of those headlines, quiet and human. I called Maya before dawn. She answered on the second ring. Maya, I said. Jonas stable. She paused a breath. Good, she said. We did what we had to do. Her voice did not lift in triumph. We exposed it, she added. Dante let them bury the logs in some legal box. I promised I would not. You remember that night you stopped the vote, the way you stood at the table. That's still our decision point. Dante let it become the only one that defines you. She used my name twice in the sentence. It sounded like a plea. I hung up and walked back into the glass room. The board had left the projector on. The recording sat in the center of the table like a small, legal device. I placed the prototype case on top of Maya's stack of logs, concrete things, paper and metal, and a recording. They were the only honest artifacts left of what we had built. I turned the lights off one by one until the room was a rim of warm amber against a cold city. The office hummed. A building maintenance light blinked in the stairwell. I locked the door, the click echoing in the corridor. I sat in the dark with the prototype and a pad of signed papers, and felt the consequences of the night's choices settle in my shoulders as if someone had put a coat on me that would not come off. Then a hard knock sounded at the office door. I stood and moved toward it, the sound cutting the quiet. I opened it a crack. Maya was there, scarf like a dark stripe around her neck, her eyes clear with decision. We keep the logs public, she said. We start the audit tomorrow. We bring in counsel that 1 TB in Mark's pocket. She held out her phone with an email draft. I took it and read the first line aloud. We will not sell the company to silence our people. My mouth formed the sentence as a concrete, enforceable thing. I looked at Maya and then at the prototype on the table. The final beat of the night was simple and raw. A decision offered, a document delivered, and the sound of the city outside already moving toward morning. I closed the prototype case, switched off the desk lamp, and then a sharp knock sounded at the office door. A paralegal shoved an emergency injunction folder across the security counter toward me and Aaron Shields. You can touch those transfers. Betrayal sat in my throat before my coffee did. I tasted metal and decisions ID already made the night before. The injunction spelled out a halt to transfers, a freeze on key accounts, and a court order that could blow open every backdated memo on our server. I shoved the folder into my jacket and felt the receptionists gather like something waiting to name me. The lobby cameras hummed. Investors' phones glowed in the marble light. I knew what an injunction meant to a startup with payroll tomorrow. I also knew exactly who had submitted it. Maya Chen walked in flanked by Aaron and 2 courthouse clerks. She carried a small leather briefcase and a look that measured the room the way she used to measure product metrics. Her steps were even. She did not glance at me at first. I heard Marla Kent's voice from the mezzanine. "Even, what's this?" My answer needed to be emotion, not an explanation. The injunction did all the explaining for me. I moved forward while Marla and 3 investors collected themselves near the elevators. I kept my hands visible. "Maya," I said, "you and Aaron brought this here." My voice was flat to buy time. Maya set the briefcase on the desk and Aaron tapped the folder open. "Even, Aaron, the court issued this at 5:30. It freezes transfers and halts any unilateral control of assets. We served your company. We served you." My chest tightened in a way that made my fingers go cold. Betrayal wasn't a thought inside me anymore. It was the reason I stepped toward her. Maya's eyes were controlled. "Even," she said, "you can move money while co-founders are excluded. This stops it." The investors' faces shifted the way tide lines shift along a beach. Gradual until 1 second they were all water. Carla Diaz, head of the largest check, said, "If there's litigation, we withdraw until it's settled." Her sentence was a blade wrapped in paper. Reports of our fight would run across 3 feeds before lunch. The lobby filled with reporters within 20 minutes. One of them asked, "Mr. Mercer, is this true?" I glanced at Jonas' name on my phone, then at the closed doors of the boardroom upstairs. The first emotion shift is a hard pivot from controlled defiance to a cold calculation. I felt suspicion harden into strategy. I asked Aaron to step into a conference room and handed him a list of critical transfers queued for 8 a.m. If they stopped payroll, people would lose rent. If investors pulled, our runway shortened into a number I had been keeping to myself. I told Marla, "We can talk outside court. Give me 6 hours to explain." Marla looked at the injunction and repeated the single corporate word that ends meetings. "Emergency session." I watched Maya as they said it. In the upper floor boardroom, I set the injunction on the long table like a challenge. Marla sat at the head and Carla Diaz folded her arms. Board members took phones out and scrolled through the leak that had already landed on their feeds. "We need immediate explanation." Marla. Her nails tapped the table. I felt the second emotion shift when calculation became fear. The numbers on the projection screen were thinner than the optimism we'd de-sold nights ago. Our runway, after the last round of unexpected operational costs, had a shorter tail than anyone had been told. I spoke while pointing at the spreadsheet. "We've isolated the product servers and I initiated a governance lock. I did it to prevent a hostile transfer." "You initiated what?" "Carla, you can lock governance alone." Ivan, her voice carried the accusation of a check being cashed without witness. "We suspected fragility," I said. "I thought we had to choose survival." Jonas' name flashed on my phone again. Incoming call from the hospital. I ignored it for the room. My hands tapped the table in the same rhythm I used when thinking. I felt each investor measuring my signature against their own exposure. 3 major investors arrived before the meeting settled. They sat across from me with neutral faces and cold clarity. "If governance is locked and we can operate, we pull funding," one said. The board's offer sounded like a vote. They offered 2 options. Relinquish operational control now or risk a drawn-out public lawsuit that could erase valuation. My mouth tasted like the coffee I'd left cold on the shelf the night before. I knew what holding on meant. I also knew what giving up meant. At 11 a.m., reporters crowded the plaza outside. Lee Cho, our prelayasan, tried to push a controlled line while a photographer shouted, "Mr. Mercer, any comment on the injunction?" I kept my reply short. "No comment," I said, and the words landed like a shutter click. On the same feed, a nurse called from the hospital to report Jonas' condition had worsened. He was in the intensive care unit with a concussion and internal bruising. Hearing Jonas' name linked the legal violence to a human body. That connection pulled the stakes away from spreadsheets and valuation and into the realm of what we actually built together. A team that once slept on couches and shared dinner of instant noodles. The build continued with another emotion shift, from fear to an aching regret. When I pushed through the sliding doors of the hospital, I found John face down on a stretcher, oxygen mask loose against his chin. Coffee cooling on the floor beside his overturned backpack. The exact image from the memory of last chapter's hospital lights. Nurses moved with efficient focus. Jonah's hands were limp, and there was a faint bruise at his temple. He groaned when I squeezed his shoulder. "Jonah," I said, "Jonah, it's even." He tried to laugh and coughed. "What happened?" His voice came out thin. "I fell on the stairs." He managed. "We were packing boxes." The prototype. He stopped and looked at me with the same earnest round eyes I had watched debug code late into the night. My throat tightened. "Jonah, you don't need to explain this to me now. Rest." I kept my hand on his forearm and watched the monitors tick. The boardroom decisions felt like a different life when the person they affected coughed and asked if he would still have a job. I returned to the boardroom while Jonah's breathing eased. Mayer's lawyer brought a set of backdated funding memos and a time-stamped server log to the projector. The documents had specific file paths and change notes. They were not rhetorical. Aaron slid them under a reading lamp, and the timestamps matched emails that had been altered. These memos show deliberate exclusion. Aaron, plainly. They show that co-founders were intentionally removed from cap table notifications, board members murmured. Marla stared at the server log like one reads a map to a territory they thought owned. The leak changed the room's temperature. I stood and spoke to the evidence directly. I did alter permissions on the server. I believed the investors would push a freeze if they thought we were vulnerable. I thought isolating control would protect the product and employees. I thought I'd buy time. My voice didn't ask forgiveness, it stated choices. Maya folded her hands and did not look surprised. "You thought, Ivan," she said. "You made choices that put people at risk." "Jonah is in a hospital bed now." Her tone was controlled, but the accusation cut. I felt anger compact into resolve. There was an argument with rapid back and forth between me and 3 board members that moved the room like a pendulum. "You can lock servers unilaterally, Carla. You knew that could trigger legal action. You need to cede operational control." "I want to cede it without protection for operations." I replied, "If you pull funding, there will be layoffs. If you cede control, who will keep the lights on?" "Marla, even 6 months ago we gave you discretion." "This is not discretion. It's override, then put conditions on discretion," I said. "Carla, Marla, name a workable plan." There were 4 rounds of pointed lines, each under 15 words, each a push. The investors pressed for immediate governance change. I pressed back with the single lever I had left. I triggered the emergency protocol. I walked to the server terminal, typed a sequence that isolated product servers and enacted a unilateral governance lock. The room went quiet as hardware fans hummed under the table. The lock displayed a status. "What did you do?" "Marla," and the word sounded like a demand for an arrest. "I locked down the servers," I said. "I chose survival over this negotiation." The investors' faces hardened. Carla looked like a stain on a white tablecloth. The emergency clause was visible in the system, a governance lock that required a board majority to override. I had used the clause I had kept for nights like this. The meeting ended in stunned silence. Voices layered in groups around the table. Some board members pressed for legal counsel. Others called their investment teams. An emergency session adjourned with no clear resolution. I walked out past the glass and down the service stairwell, where Maya had told me earlier she would not stand for exclusion. She waited halfway down the stairs, arms folded, and I stilled under the fluorescent bulbs. "Even you chose to lock us out," she said. The stairwell smelled faintly of cleaning solvent and warm metal. I felt the third emotional pivot, resolve collapsing into guilt so sharp it made my limbs heavy. I tried to bargain there, the fluorescent bulbs making our breath white in the narrow space. "Maya, give me a concession. Let operations continue. Let me run the product while we sort legal. We keep the payroll. We stabilize Jonah's care." Maya looked at me like she had once looked at a proof that didn't add up. "I will not accept half measures," she said. "Take the governance lock off in exchange for a mediated negotiation, or I will pursue full legal remedy." Her words had the precise cadence of someone used to contracts. "Maya, if you pursue litigation now, payroll misses next week," I said. She raised an eyebrow. "Then your choice is clear, Ivan. You chose already when you locked them out. We exchanged 3 rapid lines between us, each a negotiation and a measuring of one another's willingness to harm. The climax came back in the main boardroom in the afternoon when the investors issued an ultimatum. Relinquish operational control now, or funding will be pulled. The room watched as I pressed the same locked terminal and declined to cede complete control. I set an emergency clause into place that limited access to the product repo and required board authorization for transfers. It was a move designed to keep the product alive at the cost of my operational authority. The investors left the room in slices. Some called lawyers, some went to make crisis plans. The emergency clause passed into the corporate record with the quiet of a judge's gavel. It was the peak of the chapter. I had chosen the company's survival over reconciliation with my co-founders. After the vote, the building felt at once full of movement and hollow. The team wrote statements that said nothing. Locks clicked in server rooms. I drove to the hospital in a sedan whose upholstery still smelled faintly of cold coffee. The drive was empty for once. I sat in the waiting room and watched the slow march of time measured by vending machine clicks. Lee came in and told me reporters had a leaked photocopy of Maya's memos. "This will not be quiet," she said. I nodded. Jonah would have to be part of this conversation whether he wanted it or not. At Jonah's bedside that evening, I sat with my hands folded. He opened his eyes and asked, "Did we ship the patch?" He hit like a man worried about a feature going live. I smiled without humor. "We locked the servers to protect the product," I said. "We were fighting to keep it running." Jonah tried to laugh and coughed. "You and Maya," he said. "You two always fought like an algorithm." He stopped. I saw the chipped tooth, the laugh lines, the exhaustion carved into his face. "Jonah," I said, "we're still here. We'll fix this." He looked at me and asked a simple question that landed harder than any boardroom accusation. "Will it be worth it?" The question hung in the fluorescent light. I answered by opening my hands on the sheet and then closing them into a fist. It was a response of action more than syllables. I told Jonah about the emergency clause and why I had enacted it. He listened with slow attention. "Don't let them make you the villain alone," he said. His tone held the loyalty he always had. "Jonah, I don't want to be a villain," I replied, and the words were small, precise. He squeezed my hand, and for a moment I felt a weight shift away from my chest. At night, Maya packed a single box from her emptied office. She took one framed photo off her shelf, our first design sprint team photo, and slid it face down into the box. Cameras in the corridor tracked her. An office assistant offered a gentle, useless smile. Maya handed the assistant a list of items and walked out through the main doors, watched by the cameras that recorded every step. She did not look at me. The last image of her was a woman in monochrome with a teal scarf tucked in, moving under streetlights toward a black car. She left with a controlled pace that made me think of someone closing a laptop after midnight. The chapter closes on a concrete situational beat. I sat at Jonah's bedside, my phone lighting up with Marla's terse message. "We need a plan for investors board meeting tomorrow 9 a.m. I read the message, slipped the phone into my jacket, and turned my attention back to Jonah. He opened his eyes and said, "Don't make them hate you." Even I leaned forward, placed my hand over his, and whispered the only thing I could guarantee in that room. "I'll keep it running." There was no sweeping resolution, only the small, specific actions left to take. A board meeting at 9, a legal response to the injunction, a press strategy to stop the leak, and a ride for Maya that would likely turn into litigation. The night ended not with reflection but with motion. A locked server that hummed, a boxed photograph in an assistant's hands, and Jonah asking a question that demanded a choice. The elevator chimed, and the hospital corridor light buzzed as the scene changed, leaving the company and the people who built it in a state of fragile, dangerous motion. I stepped into the chapel reception, and Maya shoved a folded legal packet into my hands in front of the mourners. Shame rose hot and precise in my throat. I tightened my grip on the paper to stop my fingers from trembling, even, someone said from the refreshments table. And the word landed like a recorder playing back every decision I'd made since the first investor meeting. The packet was thin but heavy with accusation, signatures, timelines, a printed log, and every eye in the room moved with it. Shame shaped my movements. It was the reason I kept my voice steady when I said, "Maya, not here." My voice cut through the low conversation in the room. Maya held my gaze without flinching. "You promised the patch would ship last quarter." Jonah pushed it. "He saved the prototype. You blocked it." Her sentence was flat. The packet felt like a weight I couldn't set down without making the accusation permanent. The first 5 minutes were noise, mourners murmuring, a woman asking where the programs were, someone dropping a plastic cup. I moved toward a pillar to put distance between me and the reception table, but a board member, Sandra Morales, stepped in front of me. "We need to talk, even." Now, her tone made the rest of the room part. I didn't refuse. I had expected whispers. I had not expected paperwork in public. That shift, public accusation at Jonas Memorial, was the hook that opened everything. The stakes were visible immediately. Legal exposure, investor panic, and the sudden collapse of the carefully built narrative I offered at conferences. Within 4 sentences I could see the center of the problem. Jonah was dead, Maya had evidence, and the company that had been my proof of survival could become proof of my guilt. They led me into the back room beside the catering table. Sandra, 2 board members, and a lead investor named Victor Hale closed the door. A tray of untouched canapes sat on a side table, irrelevant and precise. Even Victor, looking at me across the room, "We can have the press calling about criminal referrals." "Explain the timeline." He folded his hands. His watch caught the light. The investor voice is the voice of immediate consequence. His question moved from accusation to ultimatum in a single heartbeat. I said, "I denied the transfer until confirmed the patch. The logs show the merge was incomplete." I tapped the packet to emphasize. Sandra's jaw tightened. "The public version says you authorized a delay for safety. The packet says you directed Jonas commits to be ignored." The room contracted around me. My reflection in the glass door was the man who had learned to make difficult calls alone. At 11:15 that night, Aaron Shields sat across from me in the empty conference room and slid a fresh injunction and a criminal referral across the table. He is precise. His suit sits in a way that makes people accept the terms he places on a document. "You have exposure, even, Aaron." He pointed to a paragraph that froze my mouth mid-breath. "Emergency freeze on electronic transfers, a referral to the county prosecutor if there was intent." I traced the edge of the paper with my fingertip. My action was immediate. I closed the file and stood. "We built safeguards," I said. The phrase came out like a rehearsed line. Aaron did not look surprised. He folded his hands. "You know the risks. If the board sees criminal referral and a leak, funding disappears overnight. You need a narrative and fast." He left the sentence open for me to close with a confession or a denial. I denied. Maya walked into the boardroom without knocking. The hinge of the door hit the wall with a sound that cut the fluorescent hum. She carried Jonas' backpack and a sealed evidence bag. Her hair hung straight, black against her monochrome jacket. Her expression was measured. She set the bag on the table and pushed it toward Aaron. "Encrypted drive inside," she said. "There are logs. There are commits. There are messages." Aaron touched the bag with a gloved finger and looked at me. The air shifted from legal to physical. The evidence was now a thing in the room. "Maya," I said, controlling the sharpness in my voice. "Do you have to do this now? At Jonas Memorial." My words tried to claim fairness. Maya folded her hands and did not look away. "You used Jonah as a fail-safe. Jonah died trying to protect users. If you want to own it, I will." She opened the evidence bag and placed the backpack on the table so the zipper faced us. The sound of the plastic bag crinkling was a small, precise noise that sounded like accusation. "We argued in short lines. You deleted the branch. Maya, you pushed an overwrite. Jonas' last push never reached staging. He messaged at 3:15 a.m. that the rollback was happening. Maya, that does sound right. It does sound right, Ivan." Jonah wrote the patch. "I have the commit hashes and the timestamp." Aaron looked at both of us as if deciding which truth could be defended in court. Rapid exchanges followed. 3 board members asked for copies. Victor demanded a pause on transfers. Sandra called the legal team. The conversation became a series of short, sharp sentences. Each name cut the room into smaller pieces. I felt my control slip. My palms were damp. I had counted on the injunction from earlier to buy me time. Instead, it gave Maya a path to force the drive into evidence. I asked to see Jonas' logs. Maya slid a printout across the table. The timestamp matched the messages I had tried to place in the timeline. They conflicted with what I had told the board that morning. I turned the paper over once. The paper smelled faintly of coffee and hospital disinfectant, the same scent I'd remember from the air that night we wheeled Jonna in. My next move was a gamble. I called Victor. I told him I needed a show of confidence, some political cover. Victor's answer was the investor ultimatum: even resign and we can preserve value, refuse and we pull funding by close of day. He did not raise his voice. That calm made the threat clearer. I felt panic the same way a pulse presses under skin. Steady, unavoidable, pushing into every decision. Maya produced Jonas' backpack from the storage room at midnight. She unzipped it in front of 3 witnesses and drew out a small black drive in a protective case. Aaron took it and placed it under his lamp. The drive's label was a handwritten scrawl. Raise backup 3. Board counsel clicked through a decryption prompt on a laptop. The room watched the screen. Lines of commit logs unfurled with timestamps that contradicted every statement I had made to protect transfers. There were messages Jonna had sent to Maya and Aaron, notes about safety checks and a final line. If merge denied, fail, safe engaged, the word denied was a pivot. My defense narrowed into 2 truths. Either I had ordered the denial to protect the company, or I had misread a chain of messages and failed Jonna. I tried to frame my decision as technical caution. I held that merge because C flagged a dependency. It was my responsibility to prevent a regression. Maya tapped the desk. You staged a transfer away from the patch. You had the power to merge and you rotated the commit to a dead branch. Jonna died in the hours after. Each sentence from Maya pulled attention away from process and toward motive. The emergency board session happened at pre-dawn. We sat around the room with coffee cups cooling. The window behind the lead investor showed the first hint of light on the skyline. I could hear the city wake in the distance. The vote was called to order. Maya presented the drive, Aaron summarized the injunction and referral, Victor spelled out the financial risk. The board chair said, "We will vote to suspend the CO pending investigation." The motion was on the table. I felt the room narrow to the space between my hands and the microphone. When it was my turn to speak, I made a choice. I could take the corporate line, emphasize system complexity, blame unclear handovers, or I could tell the exact sequence. My mouth held the words I had rehearsed for investor meetings. Contingency, hazards, user safety. But the packet in my bag had Jonas' handwriting on a sticky note. If anything happens, tell them the truth. Don't let money rewrite this. The sticky note looked like Jonna. Blunt, hopeful, naive in a way I had taken advantage of. I set the packet on the table and opened it. I read aloud the commit timestamps and the messages Jonna had sent. I said, I ordered the merge to be held. I also authorized transfers to move funds out of operational accounts at 3 a.m. I thought it would buy us time to patch the failing node without risking customer data. My sentences were short. I was wrong about the risk. Jonna is dead because I misjudged the timing and I blocked his patch. The room was a tight silence. Maya's eyes were fixed on me. Aaron's face did not change. I watched the investor's fingers drum the table. A board member cut in. Even what about the transfers? Why divert funds? I felt anger rise that was not aimed at me but at the situation. I authorized a temporary transfer to protect the company from a chargeback cascade. We had a window, a $2 million transfer. Sandra interrupted. Records show the transfers moved to a shell account tied to Shield's capital. The accusation landed. I flinched at the name, at the echo of deals I had made when we were still building on coffee and whiteboards. The voting began. Voices rose. Suspend, investigate, protect value. Maya spoke. Suspend and secure the drive. I will move to assume interim control and begin rollback procedures. The words were practical, not triumphant. The motion passed with a majority. My badge access dimmed as a technical operation updated in the room. The board counsel read the vote result aloud like a verdict. I rose because my body would not be still. After the vote, the fallout was immediate. The legal team issued public language to contain press. Aaron negotiated the messaging while Sandra coordinated emergency rollback procedures. I signed an interim resignation packet. Aaron slid across the table. The signature line felt raw against my finger. My resignation would be framed as a temporary step to protect the company during investigation, but the truth was a blur of lost trust and legal exposure. I packed a single bag in my empty office, while the office tower around me hummed with people relocating work. I wrapped up a slim laptop, slid in my worn leather jacket, and grabbed the thin silver ring from my right hand. My reflection in the glass showed shadowed under eye lines and a faint scar above my right eyebrow that had always felt like a private map of risk. I paused at the window and looked at the city, small lights still burning, chose a route out that did not send my face back into cameras. On my way out, Aaron stopped me in the elevator bank. He handed me one envelope. There are 2 items inside you need to know. One is a legal hold. One is a list of transactions that need to be unwound. You have answers to provide. He spoke quickly, professional. Maya pushed the evidence faster than we expected. Victor will want control. Expect subpoenas. I nodded. He did not smile. Outside the building, a reporter waited at the curb. She recognized me from a conference video and asked a single question while her phone recorded. Even did you block Jonah's commit? I kept my mouth closed. My silence became the story that night. I walked past the camera and into a cab with a single bag on my lap. In the days that followed, the company froze transfers, issued statements, and initiated emergency rollback on Jonah's code. Maya moved to secure access to staging and began restoring the commit history under legal supervision. Aaron coordinated with counsel and handed me a list of tasks I had to complete for investigators. Victor negotiated with the remaining investors to preserve market confidence, but withheld further funds until the investigation concluded. Each named person became an agent in the narrowing circle of consequences. There were moments of near violence in the process. Board members argued over public messaging. Victor insisted on containing the story to investors. Sandra argued for transparency. Maya insisted on criminal referral and prosecution. I watched as their choices altered the company's trajectory. I attempted to offer technical clarifications and policy notes, but my words were received as defensive and reinterpreted as obfuscation. A mid-chapter twist came unexpectedly. During a secure audit of our deployment logs, an unrelated alert flagged a rollback sequence that had been triggered automatically by a separate monitoring script. The script had been configured months earlier by Jonah to trigger an emergency store and hold when certain error thresholds were reached. That script had captured system snapshots and forwarded them to a secure backup. Aaron called me at 2 a.m. and said there are archived snapshots that show Jonah's process completed a merge locally before the denial. The new evidence suggested Jonah may have bypassed controls to apply a local fix. The revelation rewired the narrative. Either Jonah had pushed something I had missed, or he had tried to fix a gap I created. I drove back to the office that night because the evidence demanded it. Maya and Aaron were already there. The room smelled of stale coffee and paper. Maya tapped the terminal and pulled up a file. Jonah's local snapshot included a note to himself. If C blocks this, reroute to local staging and alert even. That line read like an instruction to me. I had an image of Jonah hunched over his keyboard, early morning light on his face, sending a message that I had chosen to ignore. The recognition cut. My face emptied and then filled with a new calculation. I had not simply blocked a merge. I had overridden a colleague's last attempt to prevent harm. We argued again, shorter and sharper this time. You the board, the merge was unsafe. Maya, you didn't tell them the local fix existed, because that fix wasn't approved, I said. Because I couldn't risk a local patch breaking production. Jonah chose to risk it, Maya answered. He put the fix where he could. He trusted the team more than the process. You didn't. My throat closed around the logic, trust versus process. The decision that had kept the company safe in my mind had cost Jonah his life. The prosecutor's office opened an inquiry. Aaron me to expect subpoenas and forensic timelines. Maya acted to preserve systems and began a public audit trail of commits. Victor shifted investor rhetoric to damage control, promising cooperation. The board moved quickly to secure interim leadership. The emergency vote had installed temporary measures, but the company's public reputation eroded in days. Contracts paused, partners delayed integrations. The consequences I had tried to manage by diverting attention and assets accelerated into a collapse of confidence. Two emotional shifts happened in quick succession. First, shame calcified into something like accountability. I started answering precise questions, turning away from rehearsed corporate language and admitting sequence and error where I had previously offered only technical phrases. Second, accountability slid into a new, quieter anger, not at other people, but at the choices I had made when I believed the company was the only thing I had. The anger did not make me move faster, it made me precise. I spent nights reconstructing logs, handwriting timelines, matching timestamps, and trying to place every decision inside a frame that could survive a courtroom. Maya appeared in my office once while I worked through the timeline. She stood near the window, arms folded. "Even," she said, "not as a question. You could have called Jonah's phone at 3 a.m. You could have checked the branch. You chose a different path. I chose to protect the company," I said. "I chose a path that looked like survival." She walked closer and sat on the edge of the desk. "People don't survive in companies, Ivan. Companies survive with people making hard choices. You removed a person to protect a process." The line landed. It was concise and exact. I posed a final, brutal question to myself. Did I push Jonah out of the way, figuratively, by privileging money and process? Did I value control over the messy, human work of correcting mistakes? My answer was not a single sentence, but a list of actions I had taken to move funds, to influence messaging, to keep control in my hands. The list read like evidence. At the emergency board hearing, our formal climax, Maya presented timeline after timeline. Aaron Cross checked commits on the drive and spoke to what the snapshots showed. Board members argued in short bursts. Suspend, investigate, public statement. During the rapid exchange, 3 lines of dialogue cut and returned between Maya, Aaron, and Victor as they negotiated the official language and consequence. "Maya, will you accept interim control?" Victor: "Yes." Maya: "Aaron, will you handle the legal handoff?" "Yes." Aaron replied: "Victor, what about funding?" "We withhold until rollback is proven." The back and forth was quick and mechanical, like people moving pieces on a board. When it was my turn again, I did not try to reconstruct motives or hide transfers behind spreadsheets. I told the room, in short sentences, what I had done and why. I admitted diverting funds as a contingency I believed would buy the company time. I admitted blocking the merge. I admitted failing to call Jonah when his messages were clear. The confession did not end the meeting. It changed the question from technical competence to moral culpability. Board members voted to suspend me and to freeze transfers. They approved Maya's move to secure interim control and begin rollback procedures under court supervision. The vote felt like an instrument I had myself tuned. I had made the decisions that required this response. I signed the resignation Aaron presented later that morning. The signature was not a salvation, it was a record. I left the office alone at dawn. The lobby that had once been a place of arrivals and triumphant press interviews felt like an airport after a storm. Empty furniture, stacks of crisis memos, a janitor wheeling a trash bin. I carried one bag and the thin silver ring in my pocket. My steps echoed. I paused at the revolving doors and looked down at the file of minutes and signed papers that Aaron had given me. They contained everything I had done. Outside the building, a courier held a sealed envelope with Jonah's name on it. It had arrived after the memorial. I opened it on the sidewalk. Inside was a final note Jonah had left for the team. A simple line about user safety and a post. That read, "If anything goes wrong, follow the logs, not the spin." The note fit in my hand like a single precise accusation. It changed the way I felt about the decisions I had justified in rooms full of investors and coffee. I walked to my car. I placed the ring on my finger and then removed it again before the engine started. I drove without music. The city passed in blocks, in light and stoplights. My phone buzzed, press inquiries, errands messages, Mayor Esther's update that rollback had started. I typed one short line and deleted it. I could have written an explanation, a justification, a plea. Instead, I sat with the concrete aftermath. Legal inquiries, a suspended title, a company that would survive without me. Mayor's last instruction before I left was sharply practical: Sojourners backups and make sure the rollback doesn't lose any user data. We will need your technical notes for investigators, even, she said. She did not ask me to come back. Her voice was not cold, it was businesslike. She gave orders like she was placing stones where a wall had been knocked down. Aaron handed me the list of forensic nodes to preserve. Victor refused to meet me outside corporate channels. On the highway I thought of Jonas' laugh, of the chipped front tooth, and loud jokes that had filled the early office. I catalogued moments not as metaphors but as actions. The time Jonah stayed overnight to debug a crash, the night he pushed a fix at 3 a.m. The hospital lights where I had stood without saying what I had done. Those facts clung like a ledger. I had been the man who chose process over a person. In the final hours I filed a personal statement with counsel. I wrote short, factual sentences. What I authorized, why I authorized transfers, what logs I had read, what I had missed. I did not write to save myself. I wrote because the record needed accuracy. Mayor's Drive and Aaron's counsel ensured that investigators could reconstruct the sequence. The company began unwinding the transfers, restoring patches, and notifying affected partners. When I closed the laptop that night, I did not feel absolved. I felt a change in responsibility. The company would survive, that much seemed likely. It would continue because people like Maya and Aaron and others would do the human work of repair. I had a different future now, one without the CO badge, with subpoenas on a docket, and a file of admissions I could no longer hide behind press releases. I left the tower with a finished resignation and a list of concrete tasks for investigators. I walked into dawn with one bag and a knowledge of exactly what I had lost and why. The last image before I stepped into the street was the empty office chair with Jonas' abandoned hoodie draped over it. The hoodie had a coffee stain on the sleeve and a small tear where he snagged it on a nail. I felt no metaphors, only the weight of a jacket in my hand and the press of the zipper under my thumb. Then I turned and walked away. That morning, the company announced the interim leadership and the initiation of an independent audit. Mayor released the commit logs to counsel. Aaron cooperated with investigators. Victor arranged a controlled briefing for investors. The legal process began. The public would sort judgment in headlines and tweet threads. I would find out over weeks and months what a court and a market would decide. For now, the narrative closed around a set of documents and signatures I had given them. I do not end this chapter with a claim of redemption. I end it with an action. I signed the resignation, I packed one bag, and I left the tower into the pale dawn, while the company I had built continued inside without me. The last beat is physical and specific, my hand on the revolving door, the thin silver ring warm against my palm. My steps away from the lobby and toward a street where I would have to answer questions that my old sentences in boardrooms could no longer contain.